This episode contains overtly graphic content that may be found disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 15. Clarity. The skies over the vast Sonoran Desert were crystal clear that day as the streets below were busy with traffic. At about 90 degrees, the town enjoyed its winter, while lampposts were decorated in vibrant greens and reds. Sharing borders with Mexico, this town had a colorful culture as beautiful Spanish architecture could be seen from all around. As all towns have their good sides and bad, Yuma had a considerably beautiful side as well. Several homes lined a small community with small rolling hills surrounding a sparkling man-built lake. The upscale neighborhood boasted of two-story homes as they sat close together, wrapping around a capacious veterans hospital. And within these grand walls, where heroes would often visit, a meeting was taking place as a patient calmly addressed his doctor. The exam room was small as the doctor stood before her patient. She wore a sharp-looking suit with a white coat on top of it as she listened to him, a stethoscope hanging next to her medical badge that read her name, Dr. Perez. She had a beautiful light tone of skin, while her black, stunning hair spoke of her Mexican heritage. Wearing thin glasses over her light brown eyes, she held the look of a very well-educated young woman. And as she looked at her patient with nothing but kindness in her face, she patiently listened to the older man speak. Because there before her sat a very rugged man with a chiseled structure and quite a bit older in age. While the two were speaking, a nurse prepared the patient's arm for an apparent draw of blood, and as he looked for the right spot, his subject gazed at the doctor as they both enjoyed each other's current conversation. And as he sat there speaking, he too wore his own pair of eyeglasses, but his seeming to slip from his nose. Yeah, it's about 80 or so miles from here. It's a breathtaking ranch. You should come out and see it with Chris and the kids sometime. I got some horses you could all ride. But then suddenly, he grimaced at the needle now being injected into his skin, but then just rolled his eyes at the doctor as he quickly continued. My son and his wife live in Texas, so they already don't come over very often. Plus, they might be moving to Michigan soon. Seriously, think about it. The place could be yours for an afternoon, he finished saying, while looking over at the nurse with a syringe now filled with his blood as he watched the man continue to process it before being sent off. Dr. Perez looked at her patient as she tried to show her appreciation of the man's invitation, as she politely accepted without any sign of hesitation. Oh, that would be wonderful, General Meeks. I would really like that. I'm sure Chris can get some time off work, and my teenagers could use a break from all the noise. This drew Jack's attention back to his doctor as he smiled and replied, Sounds great, Nicole. Just let me know, and I'll be sure you have a great time. And I don't care if we're in the Pentagon itself. You call me Jack, and that's an order, he said, with a sarcastically stern face as she turned to the table and picked up her clipboard. As she did this, she turned back around and waited for the nurse to leave with the samples. And once the door was closed, she gave her patient a look as her face slightly fell. How you holding up, Jack? She said, hoping for him not to become uneasy. His response, however, was quite the opposite, as she was delighted to see a positive shift in his demeanor. And as he replied right back, he threw a casual hand gesture, signaling he had himself completely under control. Who? Me? I'll be just fine. Besides, my brother brought you into my life, and you are a wonderful friend. So, I've got support like nobody's business, young lady. And with you as my doctor, I'm untouchable, he said, causing Nicole to smile as they both broke out in hushed laughter. And this conversation went on and on, as she had made room just for this man within her Tuesday's morning ledger. While now and then laughing and raising their voices, the two went on as their sounds could be heard right outside of their closed exam room door. And just outside, a woman passed by in a white medical coat, seeming to be in a bit of a hurry. A badge on her chest spelled Renee Williams, and she represented the transportation outfit that coordinated with the local veterans' medical networks. As she briskly walked down the hallway, she carried a cooler that displayed its firm's name, Trinity Labs. She slightly slowed down as she watched a door about 10 feet before her open as a nurse stepped out. It was the same nurse that had recently drawn the general's blood. As he stepped out of the room, he closed the door behind him as he approached her in the hallway, smiling as he passed by. As Renee smiled back, she let out a small greeting in her modest British accent. Good morning, she said as she passed, turning her head to see him walk away. Then, still looking back, watching him disappear, she slowed as she opened the door he had just come from. And then quickly looking back, she entered the room as the lights over her head automatically came on. When she stood in the room, she closed the door behind her as she saw 3 large medical-style refrigeration units before her. The first one on the left was labeled Horizon Laboratories, Diagnosis Division. Then the one in the middle with a similar label that read Trinity Laboratories, Research Division. And finally, the last on the right was labeled MedCore Laboratories, Oncology Division. Renee dutifully approached her designated compartment as she leaned forward and opened its door. While she began to inspect the interior, she noticed several trays of vials, each filled with blood, stacked in a single spot about 10 or so high. She then placed her cooler down and slid open its lid as she exposed its empty interior as a mist softly blossomed from within. It then slipped over the now freed edges, spilling onto the floor just below. Then she quickly got to work, as one by one, she gently placed one tray after another into her open chest, stacking them one over the other. It didn't take long as she put the last one in and closed the door in front of her. leaving the center medical refrigeration unit completely empty. It was then her behavior slightly changed as she began to look at the closed door behind her, leading to the exterior hallway. And after listening quietly, she felt comfortable to make her move. She quickly opened the door to the rightest unit as she began poring over the labeled vials, softly uttering people's names. Then finally, somewhat louder now, she said a name of interest. Jack Meeks. Got you. And right as the words were uttered, the door behind her sounded as if to burst open, with panic written across her face, as she was now in a type of criminal situation. Renee's eyes grew wide. Meanwhile, a loud conversation was happening as two male doctors approached a hallway door. As they opened it, quite forcefully, one man loudly responded to the other's recent question. Yeah, but then he emails it to me, right? So, I simply respond back, hey, this is... But then, as the two entered the already lit room, they were startled by the sound of a unit door closing. And looking up, they noticed Renee as she smiled and winked, quickly passing by them as she simply went about her business at hand. The two men both quickly responded in kind as one caught the other staring at her leave, a little too lost in her feminine sway. And as the door closed behind her, leaving the near fail just behind, Renee sighed with very deep relief as she slowly rolled her eyes. Then, posing a more confident posture, she simply strolled right outside. As she stepped into her dark blue medical van, the morning sun caused her eyes to slightly squint as she loaded her cargo inside. As she pulled from her spot, she navigated the busy parking lot as a familiar gentleman stepped from the building's front doors. In contrast to earlier, he now wore a suit, that of a military general, as he watched a blue van go sailing right by. Then, as hours flew by, the sun passing quickly overhead, night now settled in for the remainder of the most recent day. But then, 8 hours north, a sign could be seen displaying the name of the facility it elegantly announced. And on the sign read the compound's name, Trinity Laboratories Research Division. Inside the lab, most of the lights were now out as all the staff had already left for the evening. There was, however, one exception to this rule, as one overly dedicated scholar pored over his current objective, now strewn completely over his desk. As he studied the photos in front of him, he crossed off items on a list, and while stumbling on others he thought differently of, he would then add some items instead. As he focused with all his mind, he sat under a dim light while the plaque at the edge of his desk spelled his first and last name, Dr. Salvador Channing. Suddenly, without as little as a simple knock, Channing's door opened. And being alone, this startled him as he looked up at the door, not quite sure who to expect. Then, an unsettling scene began to unfold for the middle-aged doctor as he watched 3 men enter his office, while a look of utter confusion swept through his sharpened eyes. All the men were in black business suits. The one in the middle wore leather gloves, as his suit seemed slightly different, while it softly glowed of a very muted neon blue. And he seemed to be the leader as he sat down in a chair across from Channing. The serious man now seated there before him was none other than the infamous Arlo Brooks. "What is this? This place isn't open to the public. Who are you?" Channing shouted. That was when Arlo raised his hand, and as if right on cue, one of his men quickly rounded the desk and met Salvador on the other side, causing the doctor to noticeably flinch. But then, Arlo's man pulled out a file from his coat pocket and placed it in front of the scientist. This caused Channing to scan the room and look at each one of them individually. He then looked down at the file and then back up to Arlo. Arlo just smiled. Channing hesitated for a moment, but eventually leaned forward in his seat. He opened the file before him and began exploring its contents. Then, with one man now standing behind the doctor's seat and one next to Mr. Brooks, Arlo watched Salvador begin to read. After a few moments in silence, Arlo slightly grinned as Channing sat forward, seeming now very involved in the reading material that had been forced in front of him. It wasn't long after that. The doctor closed the file and sat back in his chair and looked at Arlo. So, Arlo looked at Channing and quietly replied, "There, in the folder, Dr. Channing. What do you see?" he asked, looking to his subject for an appropriate answer. Channing wasn't sure who these men were, but he did not like what he had read. "I have no fucking idea. But I'm pretty sure right now, I'm looking at a psychopath across my desk." This comment caused Arlo to smile as he pressed his subject further. "Please, make this easy on all parties involved. Your cooperation will not go unrewarded, Doctor." Arlo finished as he waited for an improvement in behavior from his current counterpart. Channing looked up at the man behind him and then back to Arlo once more before speaking. He thought he should comply as he felt he was now pressing his luck with the serious strangers. Subject 1 is copied on to Subject 2. Subject 1, who is essentially duplicated and downloaded onto Subject 2, is the dominant one. This leaves its host, Subject 2, in a vegetative state, indefinitely, while the original Subject 1 is off living their life. Arlo looked at the doctor, expecting him to go on as Channing eventually did. Subject 1 can be anyone who has given their blood. Their duplicated DNA can then be altered to comply with any given objectives. The result is simply the intelligence of Subject 1 and the body of Subject 2. Meanwhile, Subject 2 can be anyone who consents to the life-altering, paralyzing procedure. It would ultimately be a programmed parasite. Finally, Arlo replied, but that's when Channing's eyes grew very wide, answering the mysterious man across from him. "And what?" he asked, as he answered in the form of his very own question. Arlo then replied as he still spoke rather calmly, "Can you make it work?" This sent Channing into a soft rant that had a slight undertone of indignation. "I guess. Yeah, of course I could. If I had a subject willing, which I don't, and I never will. And even if I did, there's still one big fucking problem. That compound described in the element chart on the back doesn't even exist." He then picked up the file and tossed it to the far side of his desk near Arlo before he summed up his answer. "So, no, I can't fucking do it. Now, can you please tell me who the fuck you are? Besides some psychopath who thinks he's on a psychopath's version of Shark Tank." Arlo then looked up at the man standing next to him and smiled as he slowly looked back to Channing. That's when Salvador saw it. A spiral scar, and it was on Arlo's neck. He grew a stern look and sat forward, as he now knew he had his target in sight. That's when Arlo addressed him once more. "You will be conducting this experiment for me, and in return, I shall let you choose your subject. It will be one of your colleagues here, who share an equal security access level that you yourself enjoy." As Arlo finished, Channing stood up and began to shout, "I will do nothing of the sort. I will not commit one of my friends to a catatonic life, having to watch every day their current life slip from their very hands. Never again able to communicate or touch or feel or smell. I cannot believe you would think I would stoop to such a level. And for you." Arlo looked somewhat amused momentarily. He did not think the man before him knew who he was. But Arlo just smiled on as Channing insisted on giving up his entire position. "Yeah, you. I know who you are. Do you not realize what you have done? Do you not realize you can still fix this? If that virus gets more out of control, you're making deals with the devils over our heads. Don't you even get it? You'll have blood on your hands. Blood of millions. Arlo smiled at the doctor as he nodded his head. Why, my good doctor, it is so much more than that. And that was when Channing felt a sharp needle penetrate the side of his lower neck. Immediately, gravity began working against the good soul, as he felt himself come crashing back down to his office chair still below him. Moments later, he found himself waking within one of his examining rooms. He was on a stainless steel table which had no gown currently covering it. As he began to focus, he suddenly felt himself thrashing about, as he soon learned he had been restrained while unconscious. Calm down, Mr. Channing. Soon you will be perfectly at rest, a voice ominously whispered. And Channing, still thrashing about, tried to focus. But as his eyes were still very blurry and unable to rub them with his hands, he simply saw shadows of people moving around him. That was when he cried out. Protesting being strong-armed, he yelled into the room in a random direction. Why the fuck are you doing this? Who are you people? And that was when he felt a cold, damp cloth dragged across his face, as his eyes were wiped of their tears and recently induced sleep. And now, being able to see, Arlo came into focus as he stood inches away from Channing's face. The answer is simple, Doctor. You possess a clearance level that will allow me to move the specimen you are keeping in Zancudo into position. Then, once your body hosts the downloaded guidance software you so casually labeled as a parasite, you will then also have knowledge of top-level information at the most vulnerable levels in the Pentagon. Arlo then laughed as he corrected himself, making Channing somewhat queasy. I apologize. Of course, that's the other way around. Pronouns, am I right? The general will, of course, be the one possessing these abilities. You will be. How did you say it? Oh, yes, in a vegetative state. Indefinitely. Channing looked up at Arlo and asked one more question in a very depleted voice. Why me? But Arlo looked at him with slight confusion across his face, and then spoke to him as if this were a deal gone sideways with a high school student. Why, Dr. Channing? I gave you your chance. I gave you precisely the respect you deserve by giving you the chance to choose first. Unfortunately, now I simply wouldn't be able to undo the words you have spoken. You see, after your decision, we put you under. And now, my friend, several hours have gone by. There's simply no more time to gather a different subject now. I am quite sorry, Doctor. You caught me in a spot. We are regrettably running behind because you see, Dr. Channing, our package has just arrived. It was then that the door swung open as Channing gazed up at the new arrival. It was Renee Williams, and he thought it odd that even though he had never met her, she wore one of his lab's transportation uniforms. But that was the least of the doctor's problems, as there, within her black-gloved hands, was a small, blood-filled vial, and above his head was a gravity-triggered bag as he couldn't believe his eyes. There inside of it was the compound he had just earlier stated simply did not exist. And now, knowing what was standing before him, one might guess his upcoming fate. Because upon a description and shedding of context, one comes to a particular spot within a very long story some time ago. One may also try something different, as they find themselves beginning to breach a fourth wall within said story itself. And while they raise this forbidden barrier, this following thought would be on the forefront of their minds. When describing this man who is simply a host, thing two might come to one's foremost attention, that if a story were told of sad shell of a man, that this story should speak now of two separate names. For as Salvador Channing is still lying before them, he is soon to be controlled by just a part of a general. a military officer who once called himself General Jack Davis Meeks. And as Channing quickly did the math, he knew that his fate had long been sealed. Now, just the thoughts of his soon-to-be fleshy prison flashed before his eyes as he looked to Renee once more. And as she approached him, he knew it would be over soon, as a tough, rocky journey was about to set in. He watched her attach the vial to a tube that now led to his arms, as the general's blood slowly began to seep in. Sal wept. Although repetition can be slightly upsetting, a very familiar scene opens, as hallways can be seen all around. While uniformed personnel approach from time to time, they quickly stopped and placed their backs against the corridor walls. And as they watched something pass on by, Trevor could be seen following Thomas, being dragged by 2 armed guards. As Thomas kept the lead, the security guards behind him, dressed in their yellow and black uniforms, each held Trevor by his underarms, seeming to carry his entire weight. And upon a closer look, one could see why, as Trevor had been severely beaten as blood dripped onto the glossy gray floors below. Thomas, meanwhile, held a smug face as he walked down the hall, knowing that he was soon to close this Meeks case once and for all. He also knew that this time, unlike the last, he had the correct man before him, as this time he had observed an increase in caution, not wanting to repeat his recent affairs. He had tested Trevor's blood back on the grounded plane, while him and Kit were still incapacitated. Trevor's face was completely swollen, as bleeding wounds on his face simply went without any medical attention. He had been beaten while being questioned, during a quick debriefing from his captor, just upon waking up. His left eye was completely shut, due to a blow to the skull, as a dark shade of purple now sat squarely in its place. As they rushed him down the familiar hallway, they came across 2 large familiar doors, where a familiar guard stood in his familiar spot. And as these doors slid open, Trevor was brought right through them as he finally laid his eyes on the vacuum of space. And then, while he was dragged down the hall, he looked through the windows around him, but did not seem to really care. Instead, peering into the blackness around him, he grew a look that some might find rather simple to translate. Same fucking shit. Just a different day. And as expected, they came to another set of double doors, which automatically opened as they quickly approached. And now before them sat Kostyalenkov behind his elegant office desk while smoking a cigar. When Lenkov peered up, he smiled at the sight of Trevor as a black flash seemed to cross the oligarch's eyes. As Thomas approached, he quickly stopped at his superior's desk as he removed a glove to shake the Russian's hand. I assume we are content with the status of South America, sir. Lenkov grew a serious face as he answered Thomas, maintaining his eyes on Trevor while doing so. This is no concern of mine anymore, American comrade. This is my concern now. This is my only concern. Thomas grew a confused expression and rolled his eyes. He found it irritating that he had to come up with the ruse in the first place. And now that it simply wasn't a concern, it sat rather poorly with Shields. Then looking at Lenkov staring at Trevor, now, apparently the oligarch's only concern, Thomas spoke once more to his boss. He won't be any trouble for your men anymore. These 7 tracker picked him up in the Philippines. Apparently, he was sent to spy on our operations in China. Had Kit with him too, so obviously Lucas has already been in contact with him. He needs to be processed. That was when Lenkov sounded off. In the meantime, I have something for this Mr. Meeks. With that, the Russian stood up as he opened a drawer of his desk and pulled out what appeared to be a small black belt. Then, he threw the belt high in the air, sending it right to the tip of Thomas's finger as he successfully caught the far-flung object. After a quick look at the item now in his hand, Thomas quickly kneeled next to Trevor, causing his hostage to flinch at what might have been coming his way. Then, strangely, Trevor felt the object being strapped to his right upper thigh as the guards let him fall to the floor. After this, Trevor sensed the weirdest thing, as now it felt as though the belt were eating his very own flesh, while several microscopic needles within the strap punctured his skin. Then, just like one thing after the other, the pain immediately left as he felt a slight vibration throughout his entire body. His mouth soon tasted of iron and copper. Once the taste settled in, his heart quickly raced, while he was thrust to the floor as if gravity were violently crushing him. And it didn't take long for the math to quickly add up, as Trevor realized he was glued to the floor within a magnetic field, and he was its magnet in question. That was when Thomas gave a friendly and casual salute to Lenkov as he and the guards turned and left the room. And Trevor, heaving up and down, was barely able to support his head as he watched the Russian in front of him return to the other side of his desk as he then took a seat. Trevor's anger was barely holding on as he became physically tired, while every one of his muscles were in an intense state of overdrive. As the doors closed behind him, he still could not put a single thought through his head without the pain from the magnetic force ushering it quickly away. This had caused him to completely overlook a door far off to the side as it slowly slid open to a darkened room. But it was this void that caught his eye as his mood immediately shifted. That was when he finally laid his eyes on her. It was Delilah, and then, right after her, little Caleb. They each hurried up to him, screaming while they ran as Trevor somehow managed to grow a rather large smile. And as they closed in on him, a cheerful reunion took place as Delilah cried out, "Uncle Trevor, please, I want to go home." As she said this, Caleb spoke up. "I don't like the dark places anymore. I want to go home, please." But this last comment threw Trevor as he grimaced through his pain and responded to the small child before him, stuttering as he did so. "What do you mean, Caleb? What's the dark place? What did they do to you?" he said, while peering up to Lenkov before him behind the large, smooth desk. Lenkov, never seen by Trevor before, remained still and did not speak, while looking right at the scene across his desk, seeming content with its progression. Trevor, not knowing the man before him, could not make sense of the Russian's blank expression. But that was when Trevor's heart completely sank, as both the kids were drugged by the hairs of their heads, halfway back the way they had come. And as he watched this, completely helpless, not even able to lift a finger, he looked up to see a man in black and yellow deliver them to a familiar new arrival. Trevor immediately knew who it was. It was Arlo Brooks, wearing a typical dark suit, this time with a glow of orange emanating from within, almost looking like actual fire as his body shifted. Arlo hung his head in a menacing way while he looked straight up at Trevor as he began to address him. And with Trevor's kids now at his enemy's feet, he looked on, finding it harder to breathe. And as he watched Arlo's lips move, the words seemed to come out as if someone had pressed slow motion. "I have had my fill with you, Mr. Meeks. You will soon learn it was not wise to cross me," he said as he seemed to grow his voice deeper. And as he looked at Trevor, he continued to speak as if the words were already hanging in the room, and he was just simply their conductor. "Your time has expired, Mr. Meeks. A new time is upon us now." Suddenly, Trevor shouted as he felt his neck forced to twist. Then, once in the position that Arlo intended, Trevor could not believe his eyes. There, behind the oligarch's desk, the earth sat, as if it were framed inside the massive window. Trevor took the entire globe in, never having seen it from such a height. At least, not in reality. Of course, he didn't have to breach the subject of irony, as he found himself unable to appreciate it at the moment. But after Arlo's next words, Trevor thought that perhaps he should have tried. As I'm sure you've learned by now, my elusive friend, they keep you out, and they don't let you see in. They were there simply for your protection, Mr. Meeks. For if you were to simply shut them all off, perhaps if I put them in a state of suspension, then, my friend, you would see that your human mind simply could not take it. And it was at this point, Arlo merely waved to the window as billions of cattle guards stood down. Then, in their absence, Trevor felt his sense of mortality smack him directly in the gut as a dark shadow slowly expanded the earth. While he laid there and watched, his head forced to see, he could tell it was not from clouds or storms, as wherever there was dark, there was simply nothing. It was as if the planet simply dissolved into non-existence. And as he gazed through the window, he suddenly remembered the children and looked away from the earth, which was now only 3/4 its original size. And that was when he finally managed to say a few words. What the hell has this got to do with them? Let them go. Take me, you piece of shit. I'm right here. They did nothing to you. I'm the one you want. You fucking win. Okay, just please, let them go. And having the last words take his remaining oxygen, Trevor collapsed to the floor and became very dizzy as his lungs recovered from the lost breaths from his speaking. Arlo replied, as his voice filled the entire room. Trevor's dizziness only added to his deep voice as the lights around him strangely dimmed. You wish to take their places. Is that what you would like? Trevor looked up as he said this, unable to answer, simply lacking the air to do so. Arlo gave him time, however, as he continued to speak, grabbing Caleb by his scalp and pulling him closer, causing the young boy to cry. You must understand, Mr. Meeks. To have chaos, you must have a plan. And this one? I have chosen this one for a very special plan. You may watch him as he drifts away if you would like. Oh, Trevor, the things that we will then see. Arlo began to forcefully rub Caleb's face, making the boy feel extremely frightened. Sobbing, he looked at his uncle on the floor, hoping for Trevor to come and place him upon his shoulders, like he had done so many times before. He just knew it would happen. It would not be long now. His uncle had never let him down before. But then, a shudder took over his little boy's body as Arlo continued his speech. Because then Mr. Meeks, with his face growing smaller and smaller, he'll then vanish into its dark clutches. And within his tiny disabled capsule, his eyes will soon widen. And then he'll begin to feel it, Mr. Meeks. The awesome energy of chaos in its purest form. You will watch him as his face will soon rip from his skull. And then there, within the vacuum of space itself, you will see his little eyes burst from their tiny sockets. Then Arlo grew a confused look. And you? You wish to suffer this instead? Is this what you want, Mr. Meeks? You wish to take his place? This signaled Trevor to focus all his energy on a few loud words. Of course, I would. Let him go. And with that, and somewhat surprisingly, Arlo let the boy's scalp go, letting Caleb run right up to Trevor while he held Delilah back. And as Trevor braced for the impact, he anticipated the warmth of his nephew's embrace. But that was when it happened. Trevor's face fell immediately as his entire body went into pure and chaotic overdrive. Now, Delilah screaming, a loud ring resonated within his ears as Trevor watched Caleb's head smack its little face into the cold concrete floor below, a bullet having just gone through the back of his tiny 6-year-old skull. And as Trevor trembled, a deep sense of rage became apparent across his face as he looked at Caleb's lifeless body on the floor before him. Then, he slowly looked back to Arlo, who was now holding the literal smoking gun. Trevor's words were nearly indiscernible, as his crying gave him great pain, making him exceedingly weak. Upon all the snot, blood, tears, and swollen lips, he was able to utter 5 shaky words. "We just made a deal," he tearfully cried, gaining a look of unsettling satisfaction from his aggressor, as Arlo held a stern expression. And as he spoke, he muzzled Delilah's cries by looking at her with his deepest and darkest eyes, causing images to flash within her innocent mind. Seeming paralyzed by his deep stare, she grew quiet while still sobbing, looking at her brother, now lifeless on the floor, 10 or so feet away. Then Arlo looked back up as he finally replied to Trevor's remark. "So we did, Mr. Meeks, and do not worry. You will soon be just outside exactly as promised, and Caleb here has taken your place." Arlo cocked his head and threw Trevor a devilish grin. "Because that was the deal, my young human friend." And after noticing no response from his hostage, he continued speaking, defending his most recent murder. "Why, don't you remember? You wished to switch with his place," he said, as Delilah began to grow quiet. As she did so, a rage seemed to rise from within her. She looked up at Arlo, now facing away from her, and knowing that her brother was gone, she hated this man before her. She hated him with her entire being. Then, while Trevor continued to struggle, Arlo proceeded in giving him some more bad news, as if this were not a dark enough outcome for his 3 victims. His voice became yet again deeper, while his lips ceased to move, as he glided up to his trembling hostage and spoke, his words echoing within Trevor's mind. And as he listened, he looked up to see Delilah, now crying on her knees alone, as her captor left her behind him and approached Meeks. Then, making Trevor's blood run completely cold, Arlo began to glide along the floor as he came closer, his feet no longer touching the ground. And as he effortlessly slid to his side, he dodged the small boy's body as he left Delilah now several feet behind. He spoke, this time within his captive's own mind, leaving Delilah to hear nothing as his words filled Trevor's entire soul. "And now that you have chosen which one's place you wish to take, your little Delilah will be all mine. And when she is a young woman, I shall splice myself onto her, as she will then rule at my side, with a smile on her vacant face as she sits catatonically imprisoned within her young adult's mind," he said, not moving his lips, his eyes now even darker after gliding right up to Trevor's collapsed body. That was when he noticed Trevor begin to struggle to protest once more, as he waited patiently for his subservient to speak. And as he did, Arlo kneeled by his side to listen closely as Trevor's weak voice began to shatter on the ground. "Who the fuck are you?" Trevor asked. Then, the lights already dimmed were now beginning to flash, as if energy were being sucked right through them. Trevor looked up as he trembled, not understanding what was happening before his blurry eyes, as he strangely felt Arlo now speaking within his very own head. Arlo stood and then immediately rose above the entire room as he placed his hands behind his back while he popped his shoulders out before him, resembling an eerie-like statue position, now hovering over everyone. Finally, and deeper than ever, Arlo's words sent Trevor to a dark place, as his nose and ears began to slowly drip with blood. The words shook the whole room, as Lenkov's eyes also grew darker, while his former inferior, hovering above him, continued to speak. As he did so, Trevor noticed his skin move like liquid. "I am the Inhuman. I am the Oligarch." The window seemed to be made of several panes, as it appeared to be somewhat thick in size. Both sides of the glass were dark, as no light seemed to be emanating on either side. Peering out of the window, directly across a small black void, was a thin crack of light that appeared to shift as shadows ran up and down its length. Inside of the glass was even darker than this, as almost nothing could be seen. And the word almost was used, not as a mistake, as it represented a single dim light over the center of the window just above. While it sat within its red, somber glow, suddenly from outside the glass, casts of lights began to flow free. It was at this point that some clarity had set in on the other side, as a room became lit up in a dull blue shine. Then, where the crack of flash had recently been seen, was now merely just a steel door sitting slightly ajar. But then, as the lights illuminated a room that appeared to be a small decompression chamber, the door began to open as a brighter light then flowed in. And then, from within the brightly lit and now open door, a silhouette appeared as it slowly approached the glass, seeming to peer inside. And that was when Trevor saw him. Through his window, which was just below the eerie red light, he saw Thomas step from the shadows, now in a shade of blue glow and with a brighter shine coming from behind. Trevor squinted his eyes as Thomas approached the glass. He had already taken in his surroundings as he found them familiar, while he had earlier looked for some possible escape. That was when he had realized that he was in a familiar capsule, which was like another one he had once traveled in before. And just like then, he found himself restrained, only this time, no liquid formed at his feet. With only one good eye, and very badly wounded, Trevor looked at Thomas approaching on the other side of his window with sheer, utter disdain. Now that he no longer was magnetically confined to a concrete floor, he felt his entire body ache from the constant stress he had endured from said magnetic force. Not able to move in much direction, Trevor watched Thomas approach as his voice sounded through the glassy barrier. "Ah, home away from home, eh, Trev? You recognize this little vehicle, don't you?" he said, giving Trevor a wink. "And here, I thought it was just a solar flare. And then, as if that wasn't enough, right over your own dead body." Thomas threw his hands together and clapped. "I mean that, my friend, is something else." "Wow," he exclaimed, leaving Trevor extremely confused and angry. Trevor, now able to finally muster a partial conversation, pain still pulsating throughout his body, grimaced as he replied to Thomas. "You know, I thought you were smart. But then that version of you died. The man before me now is just a fucking coward," he said, seeming to force Thomas to roll his eyes. I know. He spoke, then growing a very stern expression. He looked at Trevor while wagging his finger in his face just behind the glass. But that wasn't supposed to happen. I told it not to conform with other factions. How irony is always there to fuck us over. "Ah, Trev," he said, while Trevor just looked down, trying to ignore him. But Thomas did not seem to mind, as he pressed the matter even further. "Turns out, since I was assigned to eliminate the Seven, it simply gravitated to you. You see, it holds my DNA, and that, mixed with a little bit of DX, well, you could imagine when I found out. You see, all DX4 carries in it a telepathic enzyme. I'm sure you've learned this by now, with such a team of man's most revered patrons at your side. Well, if one were to do the math, my duplicate could recognize that you were an interest of mine. It just couldn't identify what type. So, it found itself in a situation where it could not escape you. It had to follow you. It simply needed to be around you." Trevor slowly looked up at Thomas, as he still hadn't recognized the irony that Shields had referred to. Thomas watched Trevor raise his head as he enjoyed saying the next words to his hostage. He was supposed to protect him, Mr. Meeks. But then, because of some technical error, he led him right to you. And that's exactly why I am going to enjoy watching you die twice, Mr. Meeks. Because no father should have to lose his own son, especially by the hands of someone like you, the true coward. This caused Trevor to look at Shields with a blank expression as he tried to piece together the crimes that Thomas was accusing him of. So, you see why, Mr. Meeks. I am glad you chose to make it right. Because, like you switched places with my son, sentencing him to death, just so you could go free. Now, here we are, he said, causing Trevor to look back down. Trevor did not seem to care what he was being accused of, as he felt he was not exactly in a court amongst his own equal peers. He just let Thomas spew his hateful words as he waited for it all to end. He knew that Caleb was now gone, and every second that went by his heart shattered for Delilah. He had no idea what she was enduring herself, and he wanted nothing more than to save her. But here, stuck in this box, he was forced to let Thomas's words wash over him. I was, however, quite surprised you chose this. I thought I would be taking you to the firestorms again. But this is so much better. Any of your residual self, after your frozen carcass breathes its last breath, will simply stay that way. Frozen. I wish I had thought of it myself. So, bravo, Mr. Meeks, he yelled, gaining Trevor's focus once more as his hostage uttered a few words. And as his wounds were simply becoming too much for him to bear, Thomas found himself leaning over to hear the thin, raspy voice just on the other side of the glass in front of him. It doesn't have to be like this. People don't have to die. And that was when Thomas decided to finally shed some light on the matter for his elusive target before him. Mr. Meeks, don't you fucking get it? The only way to survive is to thrust yourself into the chaos. We humans have tried for so long to create order that we completely missed the fact. That's just not how the universe thrives. You see, Mr. Meeks, chaos is like a spider. There it is within inches around every crack and corner. Thomas then looked at Trevor as if to signal he was speaking of him in his next words. One seeking order should be very careful where they take their steps. Then, moving slightly back, he seemed to change gears slightly while continuing to speak. Take your own teammates, for instance. They know very much what it's like to encounter pure chaos. I mean, after all, they caused the whole fucking mess. Trevor looked at Thomas in almost a bewildered fashion, as he thought it quite far-fetched that Shields was attempting to relate his team to all the disaster around him. This caused Thomas to shift his head, displaying a sense of curiosity. Oh, they haven't told you. Okay, now this is beautiful. You see, this is something fun. Thomas began to laugh. He came up to Trevor as he looked at him face to face, only the glass now separating them. And as they looked at each other in their eyes, Thomas continued. All the time you spent with the kit, did it ever tell you who it actually was, Mr. Meeks? Trevor, still looking into his captor's eyes, said nothing as Thomas drew from this a conclusion, thusly continuing to speak. And he did so, as a professor would address a lecture hall before him. KIT stands for Kinetic Interface Technologies. She's a creation. Well, sort of. One of Lucas's latest. Somewhere underneath it all is a real human, though. He gets rid of them when they become too dependent on this. As he said that, he pulled from his coat pocket a very familiar object. It was a small, clear cube. It had a tint of green and was as small as a die. You ever see these nifty little cloning cubes, Trevor? I mean, you must have, right? No. Of course you have. After all, I did burn your clone upon the sands of Darius, he said, looking at Trevor, seeming to have fun in his storytelling. Perhaps ever ingest one before? Thomas noted the familiar light in his hostage's eyes, as Trevor remembered having done exactly that. This cued Thomas to further his lecture. Makes you feel powerful, vigorous. It makes you feel like you can take on the whole world. He paused for a moment, looking at the cube in his hand. Thomas took delight in his farewell to his short-lived friendship with Trevor, as he spoke with a sense of poetry, articulating his imagination with his other hand. It's beautiful, isn't it? Just look at the simplicity of it all, yet all the wonders it projects just boggles one's mind. It's chaos in its purest form, Mr. Meeks. He drew his attention back to Trevor. You know what happens if you let it take its full effect, don't you? He said, while his eyes lit up as if he grew excited in continuing his science lesson. As he looked at Trevor, he could tell that his hostage had no idea of what he was speaking of, while he took the privilege of educating his captive one-man audience. It takes several months for the entire process to take place. Years, if you know how to pace yourself. But eventually, if ingested enough, it comes to an end as a new chapter of your life begins. A life of eternal hatred and despair. Then, Mr. Meeks, as you lose your grip on reality, all your memories fade away forever as a new human is born. And this creature is hungry, but then, ironically, cannibalism seems to be its ultimate self-nose cutting simply to spite the proverbial face. It starts one day when you're feeling more powerful than ever. And then the next day, you find yourself rapidly growing a cocoon around your entire body, eventually putting you to sleep. All this just to wake up, reborn and inhuman. You see, Trevor, those aren't big bad aliens. They are us. We call them the inhuman, but me, you, them are simply just one and the same. And oh, how we truly despise ourselves, he said, looking up as if to listen to the universe itself. Then you're left to simply roam the heavens, unable to feel your own skin, robbed of all ability to function outside the realm of what most would see. As a revolting monster, he said, looking at Trevor with a morbid grin. Then, searching for a semblance of normality, desperately seeking your very own redemption, only to find the chaotic universe simply empty, void of all hope. Finally embracing the irony that is your fate, you are soon forced to return and feed off what was once your very own kind, the human race. And it was that which had cued Trevor to reflect on his own recent trials and tribulations, as he slowly pieced together the bleak puzzle all around him. And then you find home, a dark and seedy place of torment and despair, a home on the darker side of a little planet, a planet we call Darius. Then Thomas put the cube back in his pocket as he appeared to begin rushing the last of his lecture, looking at his watch as he did so. That's where they all go, even your kit. What is she now? Version 6, if I'm not mistaken. Lucas eventually sends them all to the Inhumans, the dark side of Darius, simply removing the garbage before him, to a place where Arlo has populated an entire world of those things. And there, still not yet fully like them, she is left to wander their world, soon becoming a slave to their cause. Trevor looked at Thomas with hatred filling his eyes. He could now feel Kit's fear that she had earlier revealed to him a while back. Thomas stayed focused on his one-man audience, as he continued to narrate what Trevor felt was the final blow to all his past efforts over the last couple of decades. This team you're working with, Mr. Meeks, this outpost of Darius, which Lucas has, let's just say you should do better research before accepting a position at such an organization. Then, suddenly, and making Trevor feel somewhat uneasy, Thomas changed his demeanor in a positive way. He smiled as he said his next few words. But you should feel proud. You helped us bring her in. After the 7 tracker was developed, you simply led us right to her. And now you have allowed all of this, he said with a smile, gesturing to the entire room. Noting Trevor's look of pure disbelief as he thought of his estranged partner, Thomas rolled his eyes and stood up as he began his exit from the room. As the steel door slid mostly closed, the room grew dark as Trevor could hear Thomas address him one final time. Let's face it, Trevor. You've done well. You are now among us. You are now among the chaos. And that was when Trevor saw it, as a loud noise behind him sounded as if large bay doors were being opened. But then there, over his window, the red lights shifted in color. And Trevor could imagine why this was all taking place as he looked up and watched. Then, the light turned green as he heard Thomas's last shouted words just before the steel doors slammed fully shut. Welcome home, Mr. Meeks.